to talk a bit about 2024. So actually I wanted to just kick it off and see what's the word that sums up the year for you? Tim, start with you.
Oh, okay. Unremarkable. Is that okay to say? I don't think that there are many watches that were brought out this year that I'm like, my goodness, I'm so glad that was brought out. There are a couple that came close. I think the Langer ones, Little Langer one, particularly with the Onyx dial, that was lovely. I think Cartier bringing out the new Tortue Monopoussoir, that's lovely, but I also think it was slightly unnecessary because the CPCP one was so perfect. Yeah, it reminded me that there's so much value in pre-owned. Yeah. And I know I'm, that's easy for me to say, being surrounded by these watches all the time, but there was really nothing that made me think, okay, I'd love to buy a brand new watch, please, from this brand.
But even those examples are reissues, right?
It's exactly. All about that. Yeah.
What about you, Robin? What's the word that comes to mind?
The word that comes to mind, unfortunately, is recessionary.
Okay.
But I'm looking at that more from the perspective of the state of the industry than product per se.
Yeah.
Well, at least not product in the sense of design. Product in the sense of volumes, perhaps. And I bang on about this quite a bit, but we've seen volumes fall away massively over time, over the last 10 years or so. And this has been the first year where actually the value of the industry has started to shrink as well.
Absolutely.
So looking at it from a state of the industry perspective, unfortunately, the word is recessionary.
Justin, bit of upbeat positivity.
So for me, it was vocal was the term that came to me, because I feel now, whether it's new watches from brands who immediately get feedback that's very, I was almost tempted to go vociferous, but I'm not sure if that's the right word. People are very vocal about how they feel, and that's great. Typically, as long as it's got some basis to it, and the same for us. In the media, people are very keen to share their thoughts if they feel a certain way about how things are being covered. So we're getting instant feedback in a more vocal, more aggressive way than ever before.
You've had some nasty comments.
Not me personally. I want to thank the audience greatly for the comments. There's only been
you always respond so graciously, but obviously it's
whenever there is a negative one, in which we don't need to go into the detail of what the commentary was, but I'm always thankful. So I respond, thank you. Thank you very much. Kill the kindness. And then I never get anything back. Although there was the one guy who did make a video, and I'll never forget it, this time last year, he made a 45-minute video on YouTube outlining all the things he hated about a video I'd made as a submission for another piece, and he looked at all the bits in the background of the shot. He was an American gent, and he was saying, "Oh my God, this guy is so lying because he cannot be wearing that watch because look, that's an IKEA setup in the background. There's no way he's got an IKEA setup and that watch on his wrist, and he is all." I don't know if I'm allowed to swear on this, but the quote was, and I wish I'd done this because he now has removed the video because I killed him with so much kindness. He removed the video.
Thank you so much for your kindness.
He's like, that guy is all cock and no balls.
2 minutes.
So, Mr. Wallingford, thank you very much. So that was one that stuck out in the memory. But generally speaking, people are very positive. But this year, they've been notably vocal. Yeah. We've had big launches, and people either they love it or they hate it, and it seems to catch that wave.
And I think there's a lot in these results actually that will bring out some of that kind of polarization. But I'm going to kick us off. Let's jump into it. So I'm going to start with the Watch of the Year voting. So that was the kind of question that we led with was looking at the releases that have happened across 2024 and saying, what was your Watch of the Year? And respondents were given one vote. And the winner was the White Dial Speedy. And actually, it was the winner by quite a margin. Yeah. So I think it took around 15% of total votes. And it was followed in second place by the GMT Master, the grey dial or the grey black bezel GMT Master in second, and the green dial, yellow gold overseas in third. But I mean, the difference, the step down actually between kind of first place and second place, it went from about 15% of voting down to 10% of voting. So I mean, I've got to start there. We've actually got the watch here, so it's a great time to kind of pick that up. But I mean, Tim, starting with you, I mean, what is it about this watch?
Well, I mean, the first thing I thought of when they brought this out was that that's going to snatch some of the attention away from the Snoopy 45th anniversary one. Because of all the Snoopies that they've made, that's the one that has held its value so well. I mean, they're in the 30s, 40s in pounds for those watches. and this covers so much of that same design. I think it's something that if you're an Omega fanboy, it must have been like a dream come true to have something that's accessible. You don't have to put your name down on a list necessarily to be able to go and get it, but you've got something that stands out as a really fresh design from the brand. It's a lovely thing, and I really love the dial. Solid watch.
Is it fresh though, Tim? Because I'm coming at it as a non-Omega fanboy, Speedmaster fanboy. And
I am too.
This is quite a big comment. I'm sure there'll be comments about that. But this is a lacquer dial. It's a white lacquer dial. And that's it. That's the only difference.
I'm with you. And I think it has to be the Daniel Craig effect there to an extent. I mean, I don't know who your respondents were, but the impact of the Celebrity Association must have been pretty big.
So it dropped a year before. So in 2023, we saw a photo of him wearing it. And it launched this year.
That's right.
And the results in general for Omega were seriously positive. I think it was actually, when we look at the brands in terms of brands that respondents thought had a good year, Omega actually came in second in that vote. So I think around kind of 38% of people said they thought Omega had a good year. Robin, we were talking before about, what a vote like that shows, right? You're kind of saying, actually, did Omega really have a good year, or is that just people's perception? But I mean, even if there is a difference between kind of people's perception and what's actually going on, I guess why are people thinking that Omega's had such a good year across the last 12 months?
I'm not sure, to be perfectly honest with you, because I don't think I would have said that they've had the greatest of years. I mean, an Olympic year for Omega is always a big year because there's a lot of energy in the brand. They do a lot of advertising around it, a lot of activations. But then at the same time, this has got nothing to do with the Olympics, so perhaps we can split the two out. I mean, it's just interesting that iterative design still gets people so excited. Because that's what it is. There's nothing novel about it.
No.
Justin's just said, really.
It's what the top three are.
For all that it's a hugely successful piece of design, let's not lose that. But I mean, we're nearly at 70 years of this watch now, and people still love it.
And I think there's been 3 variations of white dial as well. It's not like a white dial was the first thing. There was an albino one for the Italian market. There was the Alaska project. Then there was another one more recently. So it's not like, and the Snoopy, I think the Snoopy, so it's not like an entirely fresh thing either.
And it's the power of nostalgia as well, and I've written about this quite frequently because I think to an extent, nostalgia is the lifeblood of the industry. The fact that this is nearly 70 years old is actually a massive plus point. And the fact that it's very slightly different gives it a reason to be interested in it, gives it a certain novelty value. And maybe that's enough.
And that iterative design point, I think, is absolutely bang on. And you see that across the top 3, actually, right? So it's not only the Speedy, also the GMT, also the Overseas, right? It's all models that are in production with small design twists to them. And I think for all of the desire to see brands kind of being more bold, actually, then you kind of look at the voting, and actually people do like what they like.
People like familiarity. That's common to all of us in all sorts of spheres, but in watch design in particular, I suggest.
I wonder if there's some some impact that comes from the Polar Dial Daytona, because this is obviously one of the most supposedly hard to buy watches.
Iconic,
and it's very iconic, and particularly with the ceramic bezel, the white dial is the one. The white dial is the one to go for, and this is Omega's sort of interpretation of the same thing on paper. I mean, and actually, I really, putting them side by side, I really like the Speedmaster. It's really interesting.
There's a little bit more subtlety to it, a little bit more fun, even though actually I think I can't remember the case diameters, but I'd suggest certainly by looking at it, it's slightly larger, isn't it?
40 versus 42, I think.
And there were a couple of interesting results in there, I thought. So the Rolex 1908 actually came in 5th place, which I found surprising. I don't know whether you guys do.
It was a fairly quiet launch. It slipped in behind a couple of much louder launches in 2023.
Yeah, exactly.
So they iterated on it again. I think. It's a classic watch, isn't it? People like classic watch design.
Yeah, and actually, if I'm looking at them, I think, outside of the Overseas in precious metal, which I guess you could say is more of a dressy feel, it's probably the first one in there that's a dress watch.
The Overseas is a slightly more left field design than the 1908, I suggest. So there's an indication there, perhaps in the result, that people are looking for some degree of novelty in design. Even though, of course, it's based on a design that is now itself 50 years old as well, in fact. This has been one of the common themes of design in the last decade, is that there's very little that's new that has punched through this glass ceiling created by these designs of 50 years ago and more. And actually your results do indicate that that's still a problem for people who are coming out with new designs.
Yeah.
There's no Octo Finish smell in there,
Yeah.
for example. I don't know whether there was one of those in your long list at the beginning, but that's one of the few icons of the last 25 years, and yet it's not on your list.
Yeah. Yeah.
But have more people been introduced to that dress watch as a result of finding it difficult to get the sports watch that they really want?
Yeah, potentially that's a kind of answer to it. Yeah.
It's intriguing at
Yeah.
primary level.
The,
I also just wonder, just seeing those two side by side, how people view those products slightly differently. Those iterations that a design has been produced non-stop. Whereas we look at the Original, the 222, those models and the Piaget Polo, they stopped being produced for a long time. And I think there's something to say about the idea of a reissue being negative. I know we're coming to reissues later down the line, but we view as collectors slightly negatively the idea of a reissue in our minds. Like, you're buying it, but it's not the original. Whereas these kind of are the originals, right? They've been in production.
iterated. Yeah.
So if we change our perception of like what a 222, like that yellow gold 222 that came out last year, that was a banger of a watch.
Yeah.
Had that been continually produced, maybe we would have seen it in an even more positive way.
Yeah, less of a novelty factor, more of like a genuine. Yeah. So another result that jumped out for me was the industry. So we kind of split this out for people who are in the industry and out of the industry, and I guess all of us would count as people in the industry. And actually, the winner for those who are in the industry was the Polo 79. Tim, I know you kind of followed that Piaget trends closely. Was that what you voted for?
No.
No.
This is the one you would go for. Given the choice between the two.
I would. I would.
I madly appreciate it's a small watch.
You're struggling to get into that.
No, I just...
So elegant. I'm sorry, that is on the right wrist.
That's perfect. I mean, the design is wonderful, absolutely wonderful, and it's sort of unapologetically ostentatious. But I don't think that they needed to improve this, the original design. Obviously, the Jumbo, which most of them had a quartz movement, and I know that the re-edition had an automatic caliber in it. Not very good one, I have to say. I just think from a values perspective, I don't know who would go for the brand new 2024 £80,000 version versus the sort of £12,000 to £15,000 quartz version, which I think had a lot of the charm, and it was arguably the right proportions of 34 millimeters instead of the reintroduced 38.
Yeah.
It was right first time.
I suspect I did vote for it, and I wish I could remember because it was 4, 5, 6 weeks ago.
Yeah.
I filled in the survey, and I honestly can't remember which watch I picked.
Tastes have changed already.
Well, quite
so,
possibly.
yeah.
Quite fickle at that, I'm sure, as many people are. But for me, the re-edition symbolised where Piaget had, from where it has come and where it needs to go to. Now, I think that it amplified and accelerated perceptions of Piaget this year enormously, and it's a watch that Piaget really should have done a few years ago. Ben Klein, the CEO, has been very open about that.
Yeah.
He's only been in the job for 2.5 years or something, and when he came into the job, he said, "Where is this watch? Why are we not doing this watch?" So, for some people, it may be a little after the event, but I think all the same, in the 150th anniversary year, it was the right call.
Right thing to do.
Piaget had a great year.
Yeah.
Christy, which were the other watches just out of interest that were in that bucket of options for watch of the year? Just out of interest.
Yeah, so
I can't quite remember.
run through them. So we got, in order, we've got the White Dial Speedy, the GMT, the Yellow Gold Green Dial Overseas. You had the Eternal Calendar, Portuguesa, which we'll get on to talking about later. You can, earn your keep getting the 1908 Langer Datograph, Tourbillon.
Yes.
AP's John Mayer, Calendar for Eternity, which actually for younger voters was a big standout. So those kind of under 40 were much more likely to be voting
Power
for
of
that.
Association?
Yeah, exactly. I think that's definitely a thread that we should be talking about here.
Taking a new role up with him as well this year.
Yeah.
As chief creative designer.
Yeah,
or
exactly.
Along those lines.
Yeah, in-house collector, something like it's his guesses.
Those Tuscan, it's interesting, isn't it? Because it's cool because it's harking back to a Tuscan dial, which is just a remarkable thing.
Yeah.
But again, it's a bit big, no? That's a larger case. It wasn't a jumbo. It wasn't in a jumbo size. I think it was 30. It was a 41 version. Was it jumbo? I think it was slightly bigger.
Too big for me anyway.
Too big. Generally speaking, on the shots that you've seen anyway. But
well, one thing to call out as well, I think, and then we'll move on to the next one. Looking at those top three, actually, out of the Speedy, the GMT, and the Overseas, there's only one of those that's trading above retail, which is no points for guessing which that is. But even on that Speedy, which won by such a considerable margin. It's still trading about £1,000 under retail, right, which is pretty staggering. The overseas trading about £4,000 under retail, but obviously at a very kind of different price point. So yeah, lots of opportunities out there, I guess, for collectors who are looking to get involved.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, I'm going to move us on. So we're going to look at the second question that we asked people, which was around their most demand reissues. So we looked at some watches that haven't been reissued for a while or haven't been reissued at all, and asked people to vote for their number one on that. And here the race was slightly closer at the top. So actually the Tudor Submariner came in first with just over 15% of the vote.
Yeah.
And closely followed by the Mill Sub at around 13.5% of the vote. And then there were a few that came in a fair bit under that. So around the kind of 8% of the vote, you had the Pole Rooster in third place. I mean, does that surprise you guys, Robin?
Pole Rooster, no, for obvious reasons. It will be back in 2020. Well, I suppose we've sort of seen something of it already, but it will be back with a vengeance before we know it. It's sort of the last great Gerald Genta design watch, which we haven't seen reissued. So, no, I'm not surprised to see that there at all.
And at what price point are they going to bring it back at?
It'll be above Breitling. That's kind of, we certainly know that. But exactly what, I couldn't say.
Why would you want to reissue? Because the price point is so appealing in the secondary market, really. They're so charming. And any adjustment on size, I think we'd push back on. So, and you've got the micro rotor, the original micro rotor. It's all there, really. Getting a really good quality one in great condition is different, I guess. But yeah.
What is it about the Tudor Sub?
Well, I've got a Tudor Sub, 7016.
Got a couple, the three of them.
And I do love it, I must admit. I do love it. And I love it because it's not a Rolex Submariner. Tim and I have talked about this a lot over the years. I think we both have a love of the Tudor Sub, particularly the Snowflake. Something that really irks me about modern, Black Bay. The Black Bay undoubtedly is an insane watch, in of itself. There's no two ways about it. But these markers, these plots without surrounds on them, just changes the whole dynamic. I appreciate that here we've got a snowflakes, we've got squared blocks versus round, but I just love the fact that this is so utilitarian.
It feels like it speaks to a similar point we're making on the Watch of the Year, right? It's that familiarity with a twist, right? It's the kind of Submariner that people know, it's the Rolex sports watch that people know, right? But just a little bit of a twist that makes it slightly more fun.
I would love to see Tudor come out with something like this, where you've got Rolex. This is a big call, and I don't think we'll ever see it. But little things like this, to me, you've got Rolex crown on here, and you've got Rolex case back, you've got a Tudor shield clasp. You've got all of these different elements that just make it a quirky beast.
Yeah.
I'd go time only. No date.
Yeah.
Time only call on that.
No, fair enough. I wonder if that's people really saying, I want a Submariner in that design that's accessible. That I don't have to play a song and dance with an AD to try and get my name down for one.
Yeah. Sorry, how much colour is it?
No, I love the bottom.
I'm not being paid by anyone to say that, but this is James. Sorry. This is exponentially cooler than any modern sub you can walk out the door of right now. If you were able to.
Well, we'll get to Rolex views in a second.
Can I put that on because it's that good? I just want to.
Absolutely. It's interesting to note actually. So there was much more of a kind of demographic difference around this question. So those in the over 40s category actually were much more likely to be voting for the Mill Sub or Ranchero, or actually the Turnograph. I think there was 200% more likely to be voting for the Turnograph than those under 40. Whereas the younger audience, it was the Quantum Perpetual 5548 from AP. It was the Vacheron Constantin Mercator, and it was the Rolex Milgauss, the Rolex Midas, King Midas, which comes back to some of the trends that we started to see. Actually, we'll talk about a bit later. For industry, it was the Tanker Guichet that came top. And actually, we got quite a few, so there was another option, and we had a few other suggestions from people. The Coke GMT was something that people were looking for. A couple of shouts for a Steel overseas. A Steel 222, which I think is a great idea. And actually a lot of people saying no more reissues whatsoever. We're kind of skirting around this point around the reissues, but does it feel like it's a kind of lazy thing that people are kind of falling back on?
We talked about familiarity, which also breeds contempt. So there are two sides to every story, and there are very much two sides to this one. I've heard a lot of people in the industry, on the inside, expressing an irritation at how many reissues there are. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen the micro brand do so well over the course of the last 12 to 24 months, because these are guys who are putting out designs that are in no way related to anything that's gone before, then that has a freshness and an excitement. And if you're into watches and you're into collecting, then it gives you something new that, for a generation, is something that we can own as well. Because really, none of us can sit here and say the Submariner is our watch. None of us were around in 1953 when the first one came out. It's actually an inherited product. It's an inherited design. So I'm not surprised that some people say no reissues, because there is a fatigue around. Oh, here we go, another.
But there's got to be some caveats, because I think those micro brands, there's been some pushback. Going back to the vocal nature of the community right now, we've seen one or two that have got a lot of heat because it's effectively a copy and paste, which no one wants to see. But then again, I look at the 1921 as an example. I love that watch, but you couldn't get the original. You couldn't, for love or money. You've actually had one, but it's very difficult to get an original, and the sizing was so impossible for so many people. And the Polo and the 222, I would argue, and even the Original, have been redesigned from the ground up, or at least that's how the brands will let us know that it's been done. The bracelets are seemingly far superior, and the proportions are more wearable and more approachable. So there has to be a distinct improvement from a product perspective, or they just were not available, for me at least. I don't want to see something that was, but like the Polaroids is a good example of what I don't want to see. Because that in its state currently is wonderful. It's wonderful. Why would we? And we can get it, and we can get it.
And there's a lot of assurance in these designs as well, because there's the assurance in the design itself, because it's been around for however long, but also there's assurance in the contemporary mechanics too. We all know that owning an old vintage watch comes with an inherent risk. At some point, this thing will fail, and it will be expensive to repair. Whereas you buy the reissue, the new watch, and in theory it comes with at least a 5-year warranty, and the reassurance is that it's going to run for 10 or 15 years before you even need to service it. And that's quite attractive.
I think that word risk is really important, and not necessarily from the sort of damage perspective, but from design risk. I think brands are mitigating against that risk of rejection. You know that a Submariner is a tried and tested design, and if you put it out there, it will have success. Whereas if you try to reinvent the wheel and go for a code 1159, then you might have a code 1159 response.
Do you see Patek getting caught in between both of those fields, where they're saying, hey, let's give you something you kind of know, but let's not go too far.
Yeah, and let's dial it back a little bit. But then, you get criticised, I think quite rightly, in the terms of the Cubitus.
Can you think of a genuine new model released in the last 20 years that felt like it's been a success?
The Octave Finissimo from Bulgari, to your point, Robin, I think that's very brave design, but I think it works brilliantly well. I love that thing. It's not for everyone.
2025, let's hope for a slightly smaller movement,
which
will allow for a slightly smaller case, because if that comes in at 38 mil, it'll wear more like 40, which I think will be the sweet spot for most people.
Just be perfect for it.
Fingers crossed.
I'm going to move us on to talk about brands. So the next part of the survey that we looked at was actually getting people's views on the brands themselves. So we've dealt with the watches, we've looked at watch of the year, we've looked at reissues, and we're getting onto the brands. So we asked people 2 questions. So one was to look at which brands they felt had a good year and a bad year across 2024. And we also asked them how their preferences are changing, right? So we asked them, which brands did you not used to be interested in, but you now are? And which brands did you used to be interested in, but you're not anymore? And I think kind of surprising reading for myself on the kind of brands good year, bad year question. Actually, it's Tudor who came top of that list, right? So people thinking Tudor had the best year. Actually, 40% of people who responded to the survey, 40% of them saying that Tudor they thought had the best year. Tudor, Omega, Rolex, that's your top 3 in terms of good year. But what becomes really interesting is when you look at how that compares to bad year, right? So some brands like Cartier, for example, comes in 4th, around 30% people saying it's got a good year, had a good year, but only about 3% saying a bad year, right? So on balance, actually, a really good result. Rolex is just in a league of its own, I think, when it comes to this sort of thing, right? So Rolex both really high up in people saying it had a good year, so coming in 3rd, around 32.5% of people. But on the other hand, nearly 20% of people saying Rolex had a bad year, right? Everybody's got a view on that brand. So I mean, who's the big winner, right? If there is some turn off around Rolex, right? If we kind of take that as given, we accept what these results are saying. It looks like there's a generational split in that. So actually, it's over 40s are much more likely to be saying they've had a good year. Under 40s much more likely to be saying they had a bad year. So there's some generational split. But I think one of the things that comes out of the analysis where you look at how people's tastes are changing, is that actually if you look at the people who say, look, I used to be interested in Rolex, but I'm not anymore, what brands are they saying they now are interested in? And actually, it's Cartier that seems to be the biggest winner out of that, and quickly followed by A. Lange & Söhne and Vacheron Constantin. So, I mean, it feels like it's actually, it's talking to something deeper than I hate Rolex and I'm just going to go for other kind of similar sorts of sports brands, right? It feels like there's a bit of a shift there.
I heard someone saying, one of our colleagues years ago, saying that you come to Rolex when you first get into the industry and you start buying and you start writing about watches, and then you sort of fall out of love with them and you explore a little bit, and then ultimately you come back to them because you recognise that there's that inherent design, there's that quality, that robustness that you will want in a watch that you wear the whole time. Because let's be clear, we want something you can wear the whole time. I've gone through the process. I've learned the hard way. I bought things that I just haven't worn, and that's really quite infuriating. Vacheron seemingly, and I think Lange both benefited during the pandemic of being pushed away by the likes of Patek and NAP, and they couldn't get what they wanted there, and then they were welcomed in at Vacheron, for example, and suddenly when you wear an overseas, particularly like an ultra-thin perpetual, which I think you've got one in at the moment, that is an extraordinary value proposition, especially now in the secondary market. But I just think you can find that quality elsewhere. Lange in the hand, the Lange in the hand, to me is possibly superior. Look at this data graph. This to me in the hand, Tim, and back me up here because I know you're
immediately turn it over.
Tell me that. that to me is actually superior than anything from Patek in recent years. I think you can go back in Patek's history and you can say there's a few examples that are on the level, but to me this is sublime. Yeah. So, and I think the younger demographic, at least I feel this, is you want something that's a bit different, right? You want something that's a little bit of a talking piece. You want something that you're not going to see from everybody else. Social doesn't help this because you see great watches all the time, and that sort of desensitizes you to great design.
I spent time with
you. So you really look for the future.
Would you have said, Tim? Lange had a good year? I mean, I actually kind of surprised me a bit in that it felt like, demand at auction, prices slightly softened over kind of the last 6 to 12 months on Lange. But I guess it's maybe talking to the brand reaching a wider audience beyond just kind of core collectors.
I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. I think in some aspects, like I said before, the reintroduction of the Lange 1 Darth and the Little Darth was great. I mean, that's a sure sign that Lange is listening to its existing and like historic customers. That's a real favourite. So I like that with the subtle flair of having a stone dial. But I do think that it is overshadowed with a number of stories coming out around service costs and the sort of dangers of owning a Lange in terms of possibly being stung with quite difficult service bills down the line. And that's a hard story to shake. I wish they addressed that because there is such value with the Langes that we've got on the table, but I mean across the board. Justin, you talked about the sort of collector's maturity curve, and I do see that going from Rolex to something like Cartier to Lange is slightly more of a sort of expression of your taste. Not your taste, I mean one's taste. Whereas buying a Rolex, it's a bit like following the crowd. It's a safe place to park some money. But actually, if you want a watch that talks about your personality, your characteristics, then a Cartier and a Lange might do that. Yeah, would do that much more, in my opinion.
I'm going to quickly just drag us back to Rolex before we go off it, because I do think it's an interesting one within this. But I mean, when you're looking at that question around which brands did you used to be interested in and you're not anymore, Rolex can top of that list, right? So almost 20% of people saying, and within that question is, and will believe people when they say it, I actively was interested in this before, right? It's not that, I just would do this, it's I used to be, but I'm not anymore. And I guess the question is, is that, we're all saying actually had a bit of a nothing year, really, in terms of releases. There's something more than
volume question behind all this that I don't think we're really addressing. Because what percentage of people have been, if you're 2,500 respondents, what percentage of those will have been involved interested in Rolex at some point? Probably all of them.
Yeah.
Whereas a very small percentage of them will have been interested in Lange & Söhne at some point.
Absolutely.
Similarly, in terms of the number of watches these guys are producing, Lange does what, 5,500 watches a year, something like that. Rolex 1.1, 1.2 million. I mean, it's apples apples and oranges here that we're comparing.
Yeah, absolutely. But if you're looking at kind of within that study, so I agree, right? But within that study, you're looking at a kind of 20, so about 19% of people saying that actively were interested in Rolex and aren't anymore. There's 15% of people saying they've never been interested in Lange before and they are now, right? And so like those percentages are equivalent, right, in terms of people who are suddenly going, and I take your point, right, there's more likely to have not been interested in Lange before, right? But it's real volume of people, it seems, who are suddenly going like, actually, I've never really looked at Lange
and
before.
The percentages don't give us the actual numbers, do they? So I can't really speak to those. But maybe the more interesting comparisons between Rolex and Cartier being a volume manufacturer.
Yeah.
But also making a very different sort of watch. So you go from a stainless steel sports watch essentially to a shape watch on a leather strap. We've got the Cartier Tank Must over there, two of those. That's about colour, it's about shape, it's about form. We've got the cloche as well.
That's a beauty. But this is exactly where we're
can't
at
really
now.
compare that to an OP41 or something.
Although truth be told, it would be the ultimate balance to have both.
Two watch collection,
for sure. But Rolex haven't looked after you as a client, right? I mean, why would you if you were once interested in them, you probably went down that rabbit hole. You were excited about the exchange, and the exchange wasn't good. For the most part, that's traditionally how people feel.
Possibly the 1908 answers that question. If you want a two-watch collection from Rolex, then you've got the dress and the sports.
I would love to know that people are going into their boutiques around the world and asking for that today, and walking out with it on their wrist. I mean, that's
the reality. I think is that if you're going to spend £25,000 on a Platinum 1908, you're probably going to be thinking, I could buy a Lange 1, I could buy a 5196 Calatrava from Patek, and those are two powerhouses of dress watches.
But where have people got the confidence to put, because I actually think businesses like Subdial have really supported us out there making a decision to get into this type of thing, because you know that you can kind of get out of it as well.
Yeah.
Sometimes I felt over the years, it's like, okay, I'm prepared to take a bit of a risk because actually I know I can come back and trade it in ultimately. You would have been fearful in years gone by that, crikey Moses, I've got an option of being safe with a Rolex, or could go a bit crazy with an asymmetric Cartier.
Yeah.
I'm going to get out of one, I'm not going to get out of the other. It's like, okay. And now suddenly you can.
Yeah, you can.
So
you guys are doing my job for me here, because I want to swing us into Cartier actually, which I think of all of the brands that we looked at has had the most knockout year. It really, really has. So it actually came bottom in voting for brands that people think had a bad year. It came by far and above number one on the measure of I wasn't interested in this brand before and now I am. I think what's interesting for me is I guess the question of what's fueling that, right? It doesn't feel like, if we look at the Tortue Monoplacer and where that kind of came in the voting, it wasn't that high up, right? It was kind of top 10, I think, but not kind of much.
To design that watch.
But not far beyond that. Tim, what's fueling that, do you think?
It's probably, Cartier? Yeah, I'd like to think that it's me singing his praises, but it's not. No, I think there are a lot of brand ambassadors out there, Timothy Chalamet, etc. Tyler the Creator, I don't think he's an ambassador, but he loves the brand, that are sort of spearheading this as an acceptable thing to wear, small, dinky, interesting shaped watches. I have a statement about the wearer, and I think that's really got a big impact in younger collectors, particularly people that are slightly more impressionable. I don't look at Tyler the Creator and think I want to be like Tyler the Creator. I've got no chance. But there are many people out there.
Yes, I know you fairly well, Tim.
That was a lie. But I do think that there are a lot of people that want that look, and there's so much variety out there, both in new watches and pre-owned, that people are just exploring. There's always a new Cartier that I've never seen before that bubbles to the surface and goes up for auction. And that's the fun of that brand. So many shapes.
And that celebrity factor, right, which I think is undeniably a massive thing for Cartier and has been over the last couple of years. Yeah. I just wonder how much that's a new thing. We were talking before, and I know you've done a lot of looking at, you've wrote an amazing piece for the FT recently just around kind of that changing demographic of collectors, who are potentially more in tune with that. But how much, on the one hand, I feel like there's something new happening there, right, in the way that Cartier is using celebrity and wider culture. On the other hand, I guess, it's the Paul Newman, Steve McQueen, Sandy Watt, you look back and actually there really is, celebrity culture that interacts, but it's always kind of historic often, right? It's the historic celebrity collections that people use or brands use, whereas it feels like something new's going on, Robin. I don't know if you agree.
I think there's a generational impact, certainly, but I think it's cumulative here as well. So in 2016, Cartier says we're going to ditch the fine watchmaking division. We're going to stop focusing on these mad, crazy complications that no one's ever seen before, and which are often unworkable and probably unserviceable, and which nobody's buying. And they say, let's go back to a non-conform form. Cyril Guignon leads the charge. Suddenly it's all about Tang, Ponter, Santos, etc., Benoit. And over the past 8 years, that has just gathered more and more and more momentum. So if we believe the Morgan Stanley figures, suddenly Cartier is the second biggest brand in the industry now, behind Rolex. And this is a result not just of something that's happened in the last 12 months, it's 8 years worth of ploughing the same furrow. And I think, to take it back to the celebrity angle, having figured out what their product base is and what people are buying, they're then putting that right product in the right place at the right time. And there's that sort of wonderful alchemy there, which is proving explosive for them.
Yeah.
I just think they've nailed it.
Yeah, and I think there's a coming together, right, of kind of calculated intention, right, with a wider trend, right, that seems to be, rallying around Cartier, right. It's a kind of movement towards design-led watches, towards interesting cases, precious metals, smaller pieces. It feels like that's happening right alongside it.
I think we should also touch on the experiential element. Everyone talks about luxury being an experience now, and brands moving towards clubhouses and less sort of, salesy environments. And everybody seemingly has a good experience at Cartier. Whether that's because you take your partner in there and they pick something up at the same time as you, or whether the environment's just sexy and quiet luxury. All of those things. It's not like you're being pushed, and they don't need to push anything. They'll make you something possibly as well, which is interesting. In the watch world, that's a brand that...
Having been a customer of Rolex, Tech, and Cartier, the experience with Cartier is so much nicer. There really are very few games to play in order to get your name down for a collection privé watch or something. But with the point that you were making, Robin, I do think there is a risk that with the sort of changing of the guard and the CEO stepping down this year, I do hope that they don't lose momentum in that changeover, because they're onto such great things, and I'd hate to see them.
I don't think they will. I think Furler has proved that he's very sensitive to trends, to what's popular. But to Justin's point, what makes something sexy? It's a very prosaic word, isn't it? But actually, it's so important to this industry.
Yeah.
And one of the things that Cartier has is that it's French, and it's got that Parisian flair, which is something that the sort of conservative Protestant Swiss often just don't have.
Yeah.
They might be utilitarian, they might make a really good product and put it out there very sensibly, but actually sometimes people just want something that makes you go,
That's why I
didn't mean.
We're going to snap that one up. We're going to pump that one. 100%.
So I mean, maybe my favourite finding within this survey and the results within it is when you start to look at of those overwhelming number of people who say, look, I didn't used to be interested in Cartier, but I am now. What are they moving away from? And it feels to me like what started, I don't know, 4, 5, 6, 7 years ago, right? I mean, I remember 5 years ago when we were going mad about CPCP and it's, why is this not getting more attention? But it feels like there's been a trickle-down effect, right? It's not just a kind of, group of kind of mad, collectors who spend their entire life looking at kind of weird collectible pieces, but actually it's really come down into the wider kind of watch community, and I think you see that in the brands that people are moving away from, right? So kind of number one within that is Bremont. You've got Rolex, but then Breitling, Tag Heuer, and IWC. And I think some of those, we'll get on to Bremont in a second, right? Say more about what's kind of happening in those brands and not, right?
I'll come back to that.
Yeah. But there's clearly something, right? It's not just people who are going, well, I'm coming from Patek and Vacheron, and it's kind of more value end, in inverted comma brands that people are kind of that Cartier's picking people up from, right? Which feels like a big shift, right?
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense to me.
Yeah. Do you think? But I think that's. I struggle to think of. Well, you'll tell me that I'm completely wrong. I struggle to think of a brand in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, right, who have managed to not only convince, I guess the upper echelons of like mad collectors that there's something interesting there, but it's actually trickled the whole way through, right, to mass market, right? And it's maybe what we're talking a little bit about Langer, right? Maybe that's happening.
It comes down to the variety of products, I think, over the years, as Tim touched on. And there's been a few key players online, the Mike Nuvos of the world, that have really pushed this. And you could, I still find it confusing, quite frankly, where you can see a tank like that to my eye, looks like it's a wonderful thing, which could be 10, 15 grand maybe, but then it could also be 70. It could be a particularly interesting Paris iteration, made in Paris. Or made in London, sorry, that handmade in London before a certain period. So there's so much depth to dive into, and yet seeing it at the guy at the office with his Santos, and Modern Santos, doesn't put you off the brand. For me personally, this year I bought my first Cartier, and I've spent a lot of time with Tim, which may have been the effect of that. But I've always seen Cartier in my life, and yet I've never thought I was a Cartier guy until now. And I saw a particular case shape that just was like, wow, this is not for every day, but on the odd occasion when you feel like being that guy, that French guy that you thought in your wildest dreams when you're on the motorbike, you're cruising the streets, she's on the back, and in that life that you thought you might have led, you could be that guy for that.
Yeah, you're right. The breadth is huge, right? From kind of £1 million, highly collectible Cartier London,
with
crash or whatever,
with stamped dials, things.
But right down to must tank, right? The kind of a super value, and that those from a design perspective, they're not that far apart, right? You can kind of buy in at an accessible level.
You just said the word value, and I think that's really critical there because so often in watch industry reports, so Deloitte do one every year, for example, and so often it's made abundantly clear that three things that matter the most to consumers are brand, design, and price to value ratio. And with Cartier, particularly with the Tank Must and a number of other, there's so many watches under 10 grand with Cartier, even under 5 grand. And so it offers a fantastic price to value ratio. You get so much brand, you get so much design, even if it's got a quartz movement in it, which, let's face it, a lot of people who are buying Timothy Chalamet's watch don't care about at all. That it's propelled Cartier up because it's ticking all three of those boxes.
Okay, I'm going to move us on to one other brand that I wanted to discuss on the other end of things, right? Which I think when you look at this survey and the results that come out of it, there is one loser, I guess, or one brand that really takes a hit beyond all others across 2024, and it's Bremont. And I don't think that there's probably a lot of surprise, amongst us here. But talk us through.
I am surprised.
Really?
I'm surprised only because I'm surprised people cared as much.
Yeah.
I've reflected on conversation Tim and I about Patek recently, and we were quite vociferous in our second time I've used vociferous in one. I didn't know what the word meant.
You were talking about yourself.
We were vociferous in our response to the Cubitus because we care.
Yes.
That's the reason that so many people have had an opinion about it. Not because I want allocations, not because I want them to pay for my trip next year to South of France.
Yeah.
We care about that brand.
Yeah.
But because we've invested in the brand in the past, or because we love watches, and Patek is inextricably linked with watchmaking, and we're advocates for watchmaking. But Bremont, I'm amazed that so many people have cared.
Yeah.
I'm really amazed because people, when Bremont were doing what they were doing, people were still pretty negative. Like in our circles, in the media world, people would still, even in buyers, they'd still say, "Oh God, like those guys are, what are they doing again? They're putting bits of the boat in the watch."
It's a marketing brand.
It's a marketing brand. They're like, what are they doing in Henley? Like they built this place that they're just like, that. But actually, firstly, I always really like the guys. I've got to say, the two brothers that founded it, I remember doing a case study on them at school, strangely enough, and I thought it was amazing. They had a vision. They had a vision for bringing.
How old are you?
They went to India to try and sell watches in India, and it was. What year was this? Like 2005. This was 2004, 2005. I watched this case study in business studies, and I failed miserably at A-level business studies. But I loved that video, and I still stuck in my memory. Those two guys, I loved. I loved their vision for bringing watchmaking back to England, to the UK. All of those things. The Martin Baker watch itself, I think, is a great piece of design actually, and I would have probably bought one.
Yeah.
But I'm just amazed people cared so much, honestly. But Watches and Wonders, Robin, that was probably the moment this year that most of us talked about.
Again, I don't know where your respondents have come from, but I suspect most of them are UK or US based.
Yeah, we're about 75%.
And those are the two territories where Bremont has been strongest over the past 15 years. So 75% of their business is in the UK alone.
Yeah.
So, and it's very much a watch community brand. And as you said, Justin, a lot of those watch community people are very vociferous. But this is a really big moment for Bremont because, okay, yes, they've rebranded and they've come out with a new collection, they've got a new CEO who's Italian and yada yada. It's definitely, there's a big shift of momentum happening there. But I've spent some time with them in the last week and they are 15% up this year.
Oh.
According to the CEO. I've not seen the paperwork, so I can't verify that, but that is their claim.
In revenue.
15% up in revenue this year. So that, despite the fact that they were slammed and kicked from pillar to post at Watches and Wonders in the several months afterwards.
Yeah.
So that begs the question of whether or not there's any such thing as bad publicity.
Yeah.
Because they didn't seem to be having any good publicity at all as a consequence of the big reveals in April. But a bit like, this is an obscure reference and won't travel, but Jimmy Hill once said, that you need to be either loved or hated. There was a sports poll once upon a time. Britain's most loved and most hated sports person. He came top in both, most loved and he had a career that lasted until the end.
He's Rolex, then I guess. Yeah.
Well, to an extent, but in this case, he's
Bremont,
as well. And they were hated on so badly after Watches and Wonders.
Yeah.
And yet it seems to have generated some interest in the brand and it has spurred some people to go out there and buy the watches. They've offered more value as well this year, which going back to the point I made earlier, I think it's really important. You can buy a Bremont for $2,500 now.
Yeah, yeah.
And it may not have an ENG 300 in it, it's got a Sonita movement.
Or a triple
but again, people generally speaking don't care.
So I mean, I find this puzzling, right? So Tim, we were talking before, if you look at the move that Bremont have made, it's got a Sonita movement in it, whatever, and the hate that they're getting for that, if you compare that to, a Noma, Toledano and Chan, Denison, these kind of pieces that are kind of coming out and they're unashamedly, unashamedly not about the watchmaking, really, right? And they're getting a hell of a lot of love from the collector community. I mean, it feels to me like it's to do with sincerity and how...
Tested Beyond Endurance, to me, was the thing that I connected with the brand for a long, long time. And I actually think they had some great adverts, by the way, in the old days. I think the boys did influence those adverts in a very British tongue-in-cheek way, which was great. Tested Beyond Endurance, to me, says that we are trading, to some extent, on our performance and our movement capacity.
Yeah.
Not finishing, but capacity and performance. That's what Martin Baker was. So then the idea of that shift, whereas in Anoma was always about
design.
Design. And Toledano and Chan. So that's where I think they can get away with it. Whereas Bremont can't get away with that.
Yeah, and I think that Bremont is changing an audience. Like I talk to collectors quite a lot, obviously, and
used to.
No, I still do. But Bremont was always a very Marmite watch for the people that I spoke to. I've never liked it, hand on heart. But we would always have a conversation like, oh no, it's a great British brand. Their handmade movements in Henley. There's a really nice story with army personnel and all of that aeronautical sort of associations. Those people that I used to talk to that were fond of the brand now think it's irrelevant. And so it's gone from being relevant to being not relevant to I think, to watch collectors. And I think it's found a new audience.
Potentially new audience, yeah.
And that audience is not necessarily someone that's thinking Patek versus, Langer from a watchmaking perspective. They're looking at it as an object that you're going to wear on your wrist and it has a nice design. They don't really care about the story. They don't really care much beyond what it looks like in 2 dimensions on your 3 dimensions on your wrist. And that's probably working well from a revenue perspective.
You make a really important point there, that actually as far as the industry is concerned, as far as brands are concerned, collectors, without wanting to alienate our audience here, don't actually matter that much to the business.
Yeah.
Because this is a recruitment business. You've got to go out there and find new customers all the time because it's not like a car. You don't replace your watch every 3 to 4 years because it gets knackered. Most people only buy 1 or 2 of these things. Well, most people, a minority of people, and a majority of that minority will only buy 1 or 2 watches in a lifetime. And so for the brands, whether you're Bremont or anyone else, you've got to go out and find those customers. And Bremont's customer base was starting to shrink. So they've thrown the baby out with the bathwater, which has alienated that small number of people in the middle who said, oh, we don't like it because it's not what it used to be. And instead they've gone to a new community and said, oh, that's actually quite good, I quite like that.
The communication to me, at least from a consumer perspective, has actually improved. I like the email, I like the imagery that they've gone for. They've shifted away from the military focus, which I think right now it's difficult to sell military. No one wants to talk military and feel military. And they've talked about lifestyle. They've talked about some of the key things that we're all discussing. Being outdoors, it's about sort of getting together, sharing experiences. I think that's been positive. The marketing department, I think, has done a good job in that respect.
Great. I'm going to move us on to just two then really fun, I guess, what I'm calling kind of perception-changing events. So not by design at all, we happened to run this survey across two events that happened, two big events that happened in the watch world. And the first of those is the Cubitus launch. So any guesses, Justin, as to whether that how that changed people's perception on Patek as a brand? Positive?
Yeah. I think it's summed up by Mr. Stern's comment, which he may or may not have been taken out of context in this statement that seemingly has gone everywhere about it's not for you, then don't worry about it.
Yeah.
I disagree with that entirely, because I think it's those, at least that I've spoken to in the collector community, those that have skin in the game, those that have invested and supported the brand over years, that are the most concerned by the direction of it.
And those collectors are die-hard Patek. And it's really damaging from that perspective.
I've not seen that type of thing. I mean, maybe to some extent with Langer and its wobble it's had in the last year or two with some collectors and servicing problems. I've not seen where collectors have really taken an interest in a modern product that they don't necessarily want, but they're very conscious of the impact that that's having on their investment. It's almost like, what are the neighbours doing in that renovation? Like, is it adding value to my place or is it not? That's the synergy I would use.
I mean, the change was stark, right? So kind of before the Cubitus launch, we had around 22% of people's respondents saying that Patek had had a good year, and only about 11% who said they'd had a bad year. And afterwards, the 22% good year dropped to 7%. And the 11% who said they'd had a bad year jumped to 51% of respondents saying that they'd had a bad year. So, I mean, it's clearly had an effect on people's perception, or at least their perception of what they think they should perceive.
Well, we're very immediate as people, aren't we? So I can understand why that was the response. But I think you're right. I think it is very damaging. In long term, I think it could be very harmful for the brand, because no brand can assume that its customer will continue to knock on the door.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how big and powerful you are, you still have to look after your customer.
Yeah.
And the perception of that event and the response to it afterwards was that the customer doesn't actually matter that much. We're more important than the customer. I'm not a Patek customer, but whether I am or not, my feeling now is that actually Patek doesn't really want me very much. And it doesn't care whether I like the brand or not. And that immediately alienates me from it. And they've got a real problem to overcome that in the next 5 years.
Can I suggest, I think, because we've been fortunate to have access, you for longer than me, but we've gone to these shows, we've gone into their stands, and at times I felt like you walked into your grandparents' house with all the old wood vibes, and I don't think they've evolved quickly, and this has been for years now. I don't think they've evolved as quickly. If you look at Vacheron as a good example, or AP, even more aggressively have evolved with the times, and they're just so dynamic, they're so modern, they're so, it's just, I feel this has been coming for some time, and let's be clear, this is 25 years. When was it 25 years they last launched a new collection? And this is what we've got.
I don't want to blow my own trumpet, but 3 years ago I wrote a piece on Watch Pro called Patek Philippe Conundrum, saying exactly that. There was still a lot of energy in the pre-owned market. People are still collecting it. People still see it as the watchmaker's watchmaker. That old trope coming up time and again. But then at the same time, they've taken the old mahogany desk is still there at Patek. AP have the old mahogany desk. They've just cut it up and covered it in graffiti. That's the difference for me. And I think it's now starting to take effect. And yes, if I were Patek, I think I'd start to look out rather than in at this point.
So the second event that we managed to test sentiment around before and after was the GPHG Awards and the IWC Portuguese Eternal Calendar, which came out as winning the Grand Prix at the GPHG Awards. That Robin, I know you were involved somewhere along the way in that voting. So, I mean, really, really interesting, right? There were kind of 3 different measures within the survey. So one was on that watch was actually included in the Watch of the Year, voting, and it almost doubled the number of people kind of after that award who voted for it as their Watch of the Year. So people are kind of willing to be led, I guess, by these awards. It doubled the number of people who said that IWC had a good year. That makes sense. But it had almost no effect. In fact, it had, if anything, a negative effect on those people saying that, in change in people saying that they become more interested in IWC.
We were there together this year, actually, in a cab, heading there to go and see these things. And we vote on them. Robin's been on the panel of main decision makers. I'm on the sort of sub group. And ultimately, it doesn't include all the brands. It doesn't include all the brands. It doesn't include all the watches of the year because these brands do pay to submit a watch, and typically it's smaller brands. This year, I looked at them and I thought, for the first time ever, there's a lot of brands on there I don't even know, and a lot of watches I don't even know. But you cannot take away anything from the winners because they still won. They still won, and I'm intrigued to see the positive impact and the positive balance because brands do ask us and they ask each other and they discuss whether it's worth being involved or not because we don't know whether it is. In years gone by, I can absolutely say I was swayed by the idea of that little golden hand in an advert next to a watch. That was an influential thing to see, right? I can still think of Habring winning that thing and their famous kiss between the husband and wife on stage. And I think, Moser have won a lot. Carry Voutilainen, I think, has won more than almost anybody else out there. But in the same nutshell, I would say, look at Carey's record. And that sums up what's good and what's bad about these awards because his watches are unattainable. Tim and I have talked about that. If we had £150,000 to spend, we'd buy Carey Voutilainen. Who has that?
Yeah.
So we're talking about watches that are very, very difficult to think about even owning one day. IWC, I'm over the moon with for so many different reasons. I've been paid and by them for many years. I love the brand. They're my first love in watchmaking. I'm pleased for them because they don't typically get the love that they deserve on the big stage. Maybe it's that big brand fatigue stuff. But that watch has been redesigned, the whole Portuguese line's been redesigned to be more beautiful than it was before. That's wicked. And that watch sums up what watchmaking is all about. It's about whimsical storytelling and this idea of something living way beyond us and something we can't even comprehend. That's what it is. That's what it delivers. And for that reason, I'm pleased that it won.
Well, then maybe, Tim, maybe it's a contribution, right, to kind of a change in brand's perception, and but it's one of many, right? It's a kind of slow burn. It's not an overnight change in interest.
Yeah, I think so. That the Eternal Calendar is a watch that has confused me a little bit because I think my understanding of that watch, aesthetic changes, I totally get, and it is a beautiful thing. No two ways about it. I think all the new Portuguese line is spot on. But that is a watch that, instead of having to be sent back to the manufacturer at 2100, 2100, it now has to go back at 39.99. Is that right? The year 39.99?
Because we don't know what 4,000 is going to be.
No. Right, okay. Yeah, no, so...
And by the way, Brian Cox was going to join us today. to fully on this subject.
He stood you up.
Yeah, it's not right. But what an ambassador, by the way, as a choice to bring in. That was genius from whomever it was that decided to do that.
From that perspective, it seems a little bit irrelevant to me. And, about as irrelevant as a triple split. I would never use that either. But no, I think it's great that brands are pushing in that sort of technical achievement swim lane. I'm just much more driven towards design.
So look, last couple of things I want to cover then. So one is just around changing tastes, and actually, Rob, I'm going to look to you on this, given the recent article that I know you did and really, really enjoyed with the FT. It definitely feels like, as I'm looking through the results in here, there's an emerging generational change in kind of trends, right? So a couple of things that we started to probe in this were around whether there's a move towards independent brands, whether there's a move and change of interest around smaller watches, whether there's a move around precious metals. And I think in that order, the answer was yes, right? But kind of for indies most so, and for smaller watches after that. But there is a clear generational divide, right? There's something going on with a kind of younger sort of collector who's coming to the market, and what they're interested in is just different. And I guess the question is, where are they coming from? But also, is this a really significant, change moment for brands? I mean, do they really need to wake up and look at this as something that's around to stay, or is that just a kind of a blip of, a trend that will kind of subside?
I feel like there are two answers to that question. One is yes and one is no.
Some of both.
Sure. Well, let's start with yes. I think yes, because Gen Z does bring its own sensibilities to the table. So one of the people that I interviewed, Scarlett Baker, I interviewed for that interview, for that piece, in the FT that you're referring to, she said you can't bullshit Gen Z. You can't gaslight us. We'll see through it. We're the ultimate arbiters of fakery. And I think that there's been a huge amount of smoke and mirrors in the industry for a very, very long time. And also, when I'm going back to the Patek theme, I think there's an attitudinal aspect to the way Patek launched the Cubitus, which just doesn't wash with Gen Z. They want to be loved to a certain extent. They want to be praised. I mean, don't we all? But it's very front and centre with them. Like it's quite individual. It's very emotional.
Yeah,
and that's hugely important to say that it's emotional. And so, yes, the brands do need to somehow adapt to the taste of Gen Z and to recognise the way that they behave, the way they research, and how they understand and interpret the information that they receive is different to what's gone before. It's faster too. But then on the other hand, no, and speaking to one or two of the CEOs recently and saying, what are you going to do about Gen Z? And they say, well, honestly, I'm not sure we really need to do anything. Like if we were a mass market brand, if we were an FMCG, then obviously we'd have to do something or other. But because we are making a product that has extraordinary longevity, if they don't want it now, they will probably grow into it at some point. And actually that's okay, because the average age of our consumer is not 25, it's 45.
Yeah.
So we need to make sure they're aware of us. We need to represent our brand and our product in the right way and in a way that makes sense to them and that turns on those emotions. But at the same time, we don't need to tear up the form book and redesign our whole collection in order to attract somebody who wants a 27mm Audemars Piguet or something like that.
Yeah. So
there's a balance there, I think.
I wonder if it's just, there's something in the speed at which trends are emerging has just changed, right? I mean, if I could think back to when we first kind of started the business, the speed at which collectible trends emerged was like, absolute snail's pace, right? In a kind of great way, right? It was just about going deeper and deeper and deeper on, military Rolexes, right? And into kind of little dial details and whatever else. And the speed at which trends are kind of popping up and emerging and disappearing feels like it's changed. And I just wonder how brands, if that's something that's there to stay, whether that's something the brands need to grapple with, right? Like how do you kind of change your catalogue to reflect the fact that, making one model and just keeping it steady as she goes for, 100 years might not work.
Release as much as anything else.
Fine, yeah.
Because, when I first got into this business, there were 2 junctures in the year, SIHH and Baselworld, and that was it. Maybe there was the odd launch, still limited edition. But essentially, the centre of gravity was around those 2 events. Now it's every day. It's every hour and every minute of every single day.
Yeah.
So if you're talking to a generation that wants to be first and wants to know that information first and put the story out there first, then you need to be telling them something new on a very regular basis. And so now we see brands staggering their launches through the course of the year. And in many ways, perhaps that's the way that brands need to adapt, is to maintain this sort of constant cycle of novelty, which is exhausting and very expensive, but the winners and losers will probably be defined by how they respond to that.
Final question. What are we expecting from 2025? Looking ahead, what are you excited about, Justin, in the years to come? Or what do you kind of hope you might see from...
Well, we touched on the independents there briefly in the results, but I think the independents will continue to rise, and I think the strong ones will continue to gain momentum. There probably are too many brands out there right now, and so we might see a refinement as well. But I think there's been some acquisitions this year. Chanel have picked up MB&F, or a segment of MB&F, and that's interesting. And they suddenly become quite a strategic player in the group. I think we can consider them a group now, which years gone by we would have only done LVMH and Swatch. Watch out for Breguet. I think with new leadership there at Breguet, we perennially let down by them every year, and we all want the best for them again. That's why we comment so much. So I think Breguet will be one to watch. I'm slightly concerned, as Robin alluded to, about the volumes of product that have been pushed out into the market, as we've had good years, those pandemic years where we needed volumes to be at a certain level, and then suddenly that cooled down, particularly in China. I'm just worried about the impact on the brand equity next year. I remember, in 2008, 7-8, where certain brands were destroying inventory to try and maintain that on the secondary market. And I don't really want to see that happening again, because I love watches and watchmaking, and I'm fearful that may happen. But seemingly people are quite buoyant out there. I think you guys, with your numbers and others out there, watches are trading. Whether the price increases at primary level will be consistent, will be sustainable, I'm not entirely sure about. So I'm sort of leaving that on a bit of a cliffhanger. I don't know. I'm excited as a collector for the secondary market to continue to offer opportunities and intriguing watches.
I should say. I mean, we finished the survey actually on a question of, do you think that 2025 will be a better year for the watch market than 2024? And I think of every question that's answered within there, it was an overwhelming yes and an overwhelming agreement with that question.
Better than 2024.
Better than 2024.
I think I would probably say no.
You would have said no. Okay, tell us all.
Because I think that the trends that we've seen emerging over the last 6 to 12 months are going to continue into 2025. China's not recovering. I think there are certain territories around the world where the watch industry is going to be very strong next year. The US will be strongest. I mean, it's already the biggest market by a mile. And the US will continue to be a huge focus for the industry. LVMH Watch Week is in LA next year, in January, for example. So expect to see a lot in America. Japan's doing very well, but that's largely because the yen is so weak. And there are a lot of tourists from America and China going into Japan and buying watches there. So expect brands to focus quite heavily on those areas. But the rest of the world, India's another exception, but the rest of the world is really unsettled at the moment. And there is no sign whatsoever that, certainly at the primary level, I think you said, watches are continuing to trade. At a secondary level, maybe I think CPO is in good nick. It offers the value that a lot often the primary market doesn't offer. But at a primary level, we're seeing retailers sending watches back, inventories have got too big, people are coming into store and asking for all kinds of crazy discounts. That isn't going to stop on January the 1st. That's going to continue deep into next year.
I suspect
so my prediction would be that both volumes and values will fall again next year.
I suspect it feels like the secondary market has done more, confronting of some of the difficulty that the market's faced over the last kind of couple of years than the primary market has, right? And so I think I kind of agree with you. I think it feels like if anywhere's going to feel more pain, it's probably in the primary market. I think I spend majority of my life like looking at the secondary market, and it I get asked all the time, what do you think prices are going? And I always kind of refuse to kind of get involved in that game, right? Because it's a mug's game. But it really does feel like there's a movement of people into this market, right, that feel like they're there to stay. And I think kind of during COVID, it was like, maybe people have just kind of come in to try and make some money and off of crypto or whatever. I feel like there's a really good body of new collectors who are genuinely in it for the right reasons. And I feel like a lot of the pain around prices has been felt over the last 2 years. So I'm feeling more positive around the secondary market, but I think I agree with you on the primary.
Collectors are such a small percentage of the overall market and of what's going to move the needle in the industry. The only other thing I would say is Tag Heuer, I think, will have a good year. I'll add that into the mix. The Formula One Association is going to be massive for them. We may not see the impact immediately next year. We'll be aware of Tag Heuer in a way that we weren't before. LVMH is piling money into it, not just from the 3 brands that will be involved in Formula One next year, but from across the industry. From across the group. They're having money sucked out of the past to put into Formula One. So that's going to be huge next year. And I think over the course of the 5 to 10 years of that relationship, Tag Heuer will grow enormously as a new generation comes through. Question will be whether they have the product for them. And my sense is that they are, as LVMHs want, is that the average price of the product will still be too high for the majority of the new consumer to come through, and that's a shame for me.
Tim, final word on 2025?
I'm super optimistic about it. I really am. I think
somebody has to be.
Yeah, well, I mean, for a couple of reasons. I think primarily, with inflation hitting new watch prices, and over the last couple of years, pre-owned prices just sliding, that gulf is becoming bigger and bigger, and I think it's reaching a turning point. There is such value in watches like Piaget Polo, £10,000 for solid gold icon. Langer, you can pick up again for £12,000. It's this unbelievable value there, and I just think that can't last. I mean, if you're anything like me and you're sort of waiting for the right time to jump, I am sitting on my hands thinking, let's just bloody.
Which brand should we be looking at?
I think to your point, I think Breguet is a really good one to watch because I think
Rothera Breguet.
Yeah.
Would you be buying that if you could?
Yeah, I would and do and love it. And I'm just waiting for that new audience to realise, bloody hell, those watches are like a third of the price on pre-owned market than they are in retail. And they are wonderful watches. They've got their own real DNA and design. They've got heritage. The watchmaking quality is great. So much bang for buck.
Quite small as well, which will help.
Well, exactly. Yeah, exactly. It'll ride on the coattails Cartier to an extent. So I'm happy to see a shift from sports to precious metal dress, from big watches to small watches, and for prices to become good value again. And I think for all of those reasons, it's going to be a great year.
Awesome.
And in completely contrary to what you've just said, I'm walking out with this.
Excellent.
Thanks, guys, for all of that. Really, really appreciate it.
Thanks.
Awesome.
Cheers, guys.